welcome you all on behalf of Young Professional Forum, Indian Society of Transfusion Medicine, associated with Academic Initiative. Today is our session for free paper. We have three speakers, Dr. Mohan Das, Dr. Meenu ma'am, and Dr. Divjot for different topics. All recorded version will be available on YouTube. So please, join. I hand over to Dr. Anisha for introduction of Dr. Anil Khetarpal. Dr. Anisha.
Yes, a very good afternoon all. We welcome you all on behalf of YPF, and I take this privilege today here to invite and welcome Sir Dr. Brigadier Anil Khetarpal, who is the Chairperson Transfusion Medicine, Blood Bank, Artemis Hospital, Gurgaon. Sir has been a professor and head Department of Pathology and Transfusion Medicine at various hospitals, that is Tata Main Hospital, Jamshedpur, Army Hospital, Armed Forces Transfusion Center, Base Hospital, all in Delhi, and Transfusion Center Command Hospital in Kolkata. Sir has 33 years experience in practice and teaching of pathology and transfusion medicine at various military hospitals of the country. He has recognized teaching experience in pathology for 17 years. He has also an expertise in stem cell harvest for both adult and pediatric patients, and also therapeutic apheresis for various indications. He has been instrumental in getting NABH accreditation for blood bank and also NMDP, that is National Marrow Donor Program accreditation for Artemis Hospital. And he has experience in regenerative medicine using mesenchymal stem cells. Sir has presented various papers, posters in various national and international conferences. So we welcome you, sir, and we would request you to have a few words for YPF.
Yeah, thank you so much for the kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my proud privilege and honor to be part of this Young Professional Forum. And I must say, Young Professional Forum is doing a yeoman service to the transfusion fraternity by bringing everyone together in such academic forums, even during the hard COVID times. So thank you so much, Young Professional Forum team and Dr. Aikaj and everyone associated for this great the work and the initiative which has been taken. So that is all I'd like to say about myself. And as you know, today we have got 3 sessions, all by eminent speakers on subjects which are so interesting. I'm sure you all will like it at the end of the presentation. So I'll request my co-chairperson, Dr. Professor Pati, to say a few words, please.
Thank you, sir. I just want to express my thanks to this Young Professional Forum for this honor. And I was very pleased in the last national conference when this forum, and there are a lot of tussle, they came into existence. And since then, they proved themselves to be very good in improving academics in our specialty. And we being the old timers, we think our future and the developments, everything depends on these young people. Thank you, all the young professionals. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, sir. I would request Dr. Drupti to please welcome and introduce Dr. Pati, sir.
On behalf of Young Professional Forum, ISTM Academic Initiative, it's my honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Pati, sir. He is Faculty of Pathology in Government Medical College of Odisha, acquired 10 months working experience in IHBT department, Pijmer, Chandigarh, under Professor G.J. Jolly in 1984. He posted to Central Red Cross Blood Bank, Cuttack, the largest blood bank of Odisha, in 1988, and worked in different capacity, finally at its director, strength voluntary blood donation, and also modernized it. He also posted to SCB Medical College, Cuttack, as the founder head of transfusion medicine department to start MD transfusion medicine program. We started from 2012. He also joined IMS and SUM Hospital, Bhubaneswar, modernized its blood center, and started MD-IHBT program since 2014, and 8 years experience as professor. Also 6 years experience as PG guide and thesis, theory paper, practical and viva examiner in MD, IHBT. He placed Odisha in national list of postgraduate teaching, Department of Transfusion Medicine. Sir, thank you for saying a few words about the Young Professional Forum. I would like to hand over to Dr. Somia for introduction of Dr. Mohandas for further start of program session.
Thank you, Dr. Trupti. First of all, before we proceed ahead with further sessions, I request everybody to kindly mute themselves. And the session is being recorded, and at the end, we will be uploading it to our YouTube channel simultaneously. Shortly, we will share the Google form for the certificate. I request all the participants kindly fill out the form. The certificate will be issued to you at the end of the session. Without further delay, I take this privilege to introduce our first speaker for today, Dr. Mohan Dosh. Sir is currently the Associate Professor in Transfusion Medicine in Sir is currently Associate Professor in Transfusion Medicine at Malabar Cancer Center, Talasheri. Sir's main areas of interest are apheresis, flow cytometry, and immunogenetics. Sir has been honored with Indian Council of Medical Research ICMR's Travel Fellowship in the year 2013. In 2020, Sir had been awarded with Young Scientist Award by the Indian Society of Transfusion Medicine. Sir has several national and international scientific body membership in the field of transfusion medicine, and he has a credit of more than 22 scientific publications in the field in many reputed and national and international journals. So it will be great if you start your presentation for us.
So, very good afternoon all. So, I thank Young Professional Forum, ISTM, for this opportunity. And I sincerely thank the chairpersons for chairing this session, moderating the session. So, and the free paper talk today, I'm going to present on a poster which was submitted for ISBT 2020. So, the title of the topic is Transfusion Intensity During Induction Chemotherapy on Treatment Outcomes in Acute Myeloid Leukemia. So, aggressive chemotherapy has shown to improve treatment outcomes in acute myeloid leukemia patients. With the induction therapy, the care of these patients, they require a prolonged hospital stay. And majority of the AML patients during the stay, they are either anemic or thrombocytopenic, and hence transfusion support is necessary in managing these patients. So, earlier studies have shown that transfusion status as such has been shown as a prognostic importance in patients with myelodysplastic syndrome. And with the similar lines, a study recently conducted in the West, they found that those patients receiving intensive blood transfusion during the induction therapy, which is the first therapy for a patient with AML, had a negative treatment outcome. And they hypothesized that due to immunomodulatory effects induced by transfusion, the survival outcomes in transfusion dependent AML patients may be poor. So as induction mortality in AML patients are relatively higher, it is the Western world, and there are hardly few literatures on blood transfusion and clinical outcome in AML patients. So we aimed our study in the following manner. So among the newly diagnosed AML patients undergoing induction chemotherapy, so we try to estimate the transfusion needs during their hospitalization for the induction therapy alone, and to assess whether the intensity of transfusion during the induction therapy influences treatment outcomes. So our two objectives were the two treatment outcomes such as complete remission status as well as overall survival status of these patients. So this was a retrospective audit on newly diagnosed adult patients aged more than 14 years with AML who underwent induction chemotherapy between 2011 and 2018. So the patients received standard induction chemotherapy regimens consisting of cytarabine and anthracycline, commonly referred as 7+3 regimen. So the number of RBC units and platelet events transfused were noted for individual patients during the therapy. So the transfusion event for the study was defined as either single unit of RBC transfusion or one adult dose of platelets, which includes either 5 RDPs or 1 unit of apheresis platelets. So weekly transfusion requirements for RBC and platelets events were estimated to determine the intensity of transfusion, and RBC and platelet transfusions were dichotomized based on their intensity, either as low or high. Low is defined when the transfusion intensity is less than the median units transfused for the group, and high when it is more than the median units transfused for the group. The overall survival was estimated from the date of initial diagnosis to the date of end of data collection or death, or the earliest date to the last to follow up. Statistics: to study the association between the response and transfusion intensity, chi-square test was used for categorical variables and Mann-Whitney U test was used for continuous variables. Overall survival was estimated by Kaplan-Meier survival curves, and the difference in survival function based on transfusion intensity low or high were tested using log-rank test. Multiple logistic regression analysis was performed to identify the factors affecting complete remission status, and Cox proportional hazard model was used to assess the hazard ratio for overall survival with the transfusion, holding other clinical factors constant. Results: we had 90 patients included in our analysis. After exclusion, we had some decent exclusions due to poor documentation of the data. So on an average, 6 units of RBC and 5 platelet events were required for an AML patients to undergo induction chemotherapy, and the intensity was estimated. RBC per week was estimated to be 1.7 and platelets events per week were estimated to 1.5. So we rounded the median units per week to 2, and we dichotomized them as low and high intensity. When the RBC units were less than 2 and platelet units were less than 2, they were referred as low, and when they were more than 2, they were referred to as high. So it's a table 1. It's a base and high intensity of transfusion. So when we see the baseline, the age and sex were comparable, but in the patient, the performance status, that is ECOG status, who has more than 2, so they had a higher chance of developing a higher intensity for blood transfusion. Similarly, when we go see the baseline laboratory data, the laboratory data at the time of diagnosis, patients with a higher WBC count as well as lower platelet count at the diagnosis, they had a higher chance for developing, higher chance for requiring high intensity of transfusion when compared to the low intensity of transfusion, patients receiving low intensity. The other characteristics, there was not much significant difference between the two groups. So it's a figure plot, it's a figure box plot. It displays patients with RBC transfusions on the left and platelet transfusions on the right, with the hemoglobin level at diagnosis and platelet counts at the diagnosis. So our institution had a practice of transfusing RBC when the hemoglobin level is less than 7 and platelet counts less than 20,000 with comorbidities at diagnosis. So when we see, we could observe that transfusion requirement, patients with transfusion requirement at diagnosis, they received a higher intensity of transfusion for both RBC as well as platelets, and the differences were significant when compared to the other groups. So in this picture, you can see the blue dots represents the low intensity of transfusion and the green one represents the higher intensity of transfusion. The first plot, you can see patients who received transfusion, and this one is the patient who did not receive transfusion at the diagnosis. Similarly, for platelets, there was a differences in patients who received transfusion at the diagnosis. They had a higher chance for becoming high intensity for transfusion. So coming to the next table, if you can see the table on the top, the table on the top represents complete remission status is assessed after the completion of induction chemotherapy about their disease status. So whether the response has been attained, complete response, or a partial response, or no response. So we observed that when patients having a complete and who obtained complete remission and not obtained complete remission, the number of RBC units and platelet events were almost similar. But when we see with respect to the intensity of RBC and platelet units transfused, weekly RBC and platelet transfusion requirements were significantly higher in patients who did not achieve complete remission when compared to the patients who achieved complete remission. So we can see it is 1.5 units per week when compared to 2 units and 1.3 when compared to 1.7, and the differences were relatively significant. Similarly, patients who survived and who died during the induction period, patients who did not survive during the induction period, they ended up in receiving higher intensity of RBC and platelet transfusions when compared to patients who survived. However, the significance was observed only for platelet transfusions. So we try to do a multivariate regression analysis to identify all clinical factors, including transfusion factors affecting complete remission status. We observed RBC transfusion at presentation and RBC transfusion at intensity appeared among the prognostic factors for complete remission status, along with the other clinical factors affecting complete remission status. So the next image is on the Kaplan-Meier curve describing about the overall survival with respect to RBC and platelet transfusion intensity. If you see the figures on the left, you can see two lines. The blue lines represents patients who received lower intensity of transfusion, and the green line represents the patients who received higher intensity of transfusion. The left-hand side represents the RBC intensity, and the right-hand side represents the platelet intensity. So what we observed here was patients who received a lower intensity of RBC transfusion, their median overall survival was transfusion, where the survival reduced drastically to 5 months. Similarly, patients receiving platelet transfusion, the lower intensity had a better overall survival when compared to patients receiving higher intensity of platelet transfusion. However, we could not observe the differences significant because of a small sample size. The similar trend has been seen in patients when they are followed up for 1 year survival as well as 3 years survival, where patients with a lower intensity of RBC and platelet transfusions had a better survival than patients who received a higher intensity for both RBC and platelet transfusions. So when understanding the hazard ratio for the transfusions, so we performed a Cox proportional model, developed a model. So we kept transfusion as an independent prognostic variable while keeping other all clinical factors as constant for overall survival. So we observed the hazard ratio for RBC transfusion as 1.08 and hazard ratio for platelet transfusion as 0.87. So the discussion, the effect of blood transfusion on patients' immunity and clinical outcomes were studied extensively, but they were mostly restricted to surgical settings. So the present study, we aim to observe in a hematological indications, we observed that higher intensity of RBC and platelet transfusions during the induction therapy, it negatively affected the complete remission status for both RBC and platelet transfusions respectively. And we also observed that the transfusion intensity, it depends mainly on disease severity at diagnosis. So as we observed, patients with a lower hemoglobin at diagnosis required a higher intensity of RBC transfusion as well as platelet transfusion, and patients who presented with a poor performance status at diagnosis also received a higher intensity of both the transfusions. And in patients with induction mortality associated with a higher intensity of blood transfusions, and patients with a higher intensity, they tended to have a reduced survival than the other groups. However, the difference was not significant. In Cox model, the expected hazard ratio was 9% higher for every 1 unit increase in RBC transfusion, while for platelet transfusion, the hazard ratio was reduced by 13% for 1 unit increase in platelet transfusion during the induction period. So coming to conclusion, so we observed that transfusion support was significantly higher in patients with a high disease burden at diagnosis. Lower intensity of RBC transfusion, it accompanies to the response to chemotherapy in terms of only complete remission, but it did not affect the overall survival of these patients. So these are my references. So thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, I must say it's a very interesting presentation. And though we get patients, like ours is an oncology center, and we do get patients of AML coming to our center where they get induction chemotherapy. And what we follow at our center is that hemoglobin of less than 8 or platelet count of less than 20,000, that is the trigger to start the transfusion. That is for red cell as well as for platelets. And same has been done at your end. And but however, not much work has been done in an Indian setup on Indian patients. So I think it's a great effort at your end to have done so many cases and to come out with such conclusion. So interesting presentation. Yeah, Dr. Pati.
Sir, kindly unmute yourself. Pati sir, please unmute yourself.
Yes. Am I audible now?
Yeah.
Am I audible? Yes. So I just like to add that besides.
Sorry, I'm not getting your questions. There was a disturbances.
Hello.
Yes. So can you hear now, Mohan sir?
Yes, I can hear now. Sorry for this. Sorry, apologies for my end. I couldn't hear the question properly, completely.
So did you hear Anil sir's?
Hear only the first half. Then I couldn't.
Okay.
Sorry, sir.
No, there is no question from my side. I just like to add to what Dr. Mohandas has told, that besides this blood transfusion intensity, the other important factor to find out the mortality, all this are correlate, is the genetic abnormalities. So that is a very good other aspect that Dr. Mohandas can dilate upon and work on further and give us another paper on that aspects. He has got so many cases working in such a nice cancer institute. So the cytogenetics and its correlation with the outcome of induction. Besides blood transfusion, that part.
So we will try to get some relationships, sir. We'll do it in the future, sir.
Thank you.
I think we can go ahead with 2 questions from the audience, and remaining questions could be there in the chat box to be discussed later if time permits. So any question from the audience?
We don't see any questions on the chat box yet.
So I think we can go ahead with the second presentation.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks a lot.
And sir, we have a question. We got one question.
Okay.
If the intensity of transfusion is directly related to the disease severity, would the disease severity not be the reason for clinical outcome or not achieving remission? As the transfusion were justified based on the transfusion trigger based on the guidelines at your institution. So you can also see at your end on the chat box.
So like I could understand, decipher the questions partly. So what I understand is like what we observed is like the disease severity is one important factor which predicts the treatment outcomes in terms of complete remission as well as overall survival. So we wanted to see whether transfusion also has some impact on the treatment outcomes. So that's why we did some multivariate as well as the hazard model. So in that model, we took care of the clinical factors constant and just predicted whether the impact of transfusion had any outcome differences. So we could see only with the complete remission. Obviously, clinical factors are the one which determines the clinical or like treatment outcomes. But we also felt that to complete remission, patients who received a higher intensity of transfusion, so they had a relatively poor chance of attaining complete remission when compared to who does not receive higher intensity. So we kept the other factors as constant in that. So,
but sir, just the question being that if the disease severity is what is dictating the transfusions, so whoever has a severe disease state will end up receiving more transfusions. And as long as the transfusions are justified, like what do you suggest? Do you do you suggest a more restrictive strategy even when the disease is that severe? Because then, but otherwise it means the disease severity is also the reason for not achieving remission or a poor outcome at the end of the chemo induction?
Like Dr. Elvis, like what I understood is like not all patients who are at higher disease burden are going to end up in either fail in complete remission, so fail in their induction response. So there are certain people who fail. So we cannot change our transfusion practice with respect to disease burden. So the criteria remains same. So we have to be little more like maybe we can predict their outcomes. We can explain patients based on like a like these patients may like someone presenting with a high transfusion. Such an information can be passed on from the transfusion center side to the patient side, so they can mobilize such a number of donors. That is one aspect we can say. With respect to change in transfusion practice, we may not be able to do because it is basically a clinical decision. So I'm sure seniors will agree with that.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Shall we proceed to the next one?
Yes, I think we can move ahead.
Dr. Anisha?
Yes. So I now take this opportunity to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Meenu ma'am. Madam is presently a faculty for PDCC courses at ILBS. That is for the apheresis technology, immunohematology and blood banking, transplant immunology. Also, her area of interest are immunohematology and apheresis. Madam is in a convener SIG on therapeutic apheresis, executive member of ATOM, also member committee for national policy on hemoglobinopathies. She is a faculty for NHM training of blood bank staff from various states. Also a technical resource person in blood banking for the MPSACs. Welcome you, ma'am, and we request you to start your presentation.
Before ma'am start, ma'am, apologies, slides were by me. By mistake, I kept it as PGI Chandigarh as a place.
I am from PGI Chandigarh, so no issues. It's always nice to be introduced that way. Okay, so the topic I'm taking first, I would like to clarify that this was a PDCC thesis of Abhay M. Kumar Gupta, who is presently in Mumbai and a very bright student of mine. So he was the one who did this thesis, and somehow I'm the corresponding author, being his supervisor. So this is his work, and he did his work very, very honestly and in a very good manner. I'll start this. This has been published in the Journal of Clinical Apheresis, one part of this, and the other in the Indian Journal of Medical Research in 2 parts. This is the third part I'll talk. The impact of delayed and immediate adverse events on the intention of future donations, which I will be referring to as IFD during this presentation in whole blood and platelet pheresis donors. We already know the importance of voluntary non-remunerated donors. Whole blood and platelet pheresis donations are relatively safe procedures, and occasionally adverse donor events of variable severity may occur during or after the donations. So what is the working definition for adverse donor event? It is any untoward event or complication experienced by the donor before, during, or after the blood donation process. So the importance of voluntary blood donors can never be underestimated. Ideal donors are repeat regular voluntary donors. They have a lower risk of infections as well as a lower incidence of adverse donor events. In order to retain this very special group of donors, the blood transfusion services need to ensure a positive blood donation experience. Most of the adverse donor events are mild, short-term, and usually have no long-term consequences, but they are a hindrance to the donation experience. And a person once experiencing an adverse donor event may have a disinclination towards future donations. As per the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, 1.1 million donations blood donations were done in 16-17, but there is still a shortage. the fear of adverse donor events and the experience of adverse donor events in previous donations may be one of the reasons for a healthy population to avoid blood donation. Hence, the knowledge of ADEs and their impact on future donations are very important for any blood transfusion service. Most of the adverse donor events occur within 30 minutes of starting blood donation and are usually managed by simple measures. And they are called immediate adverse donor events. The adverse donor events which occur once the donor leaves the donor premises are usually classified as delayed adverse donor events. The information regarding delayed adverse donor events is scarce. And the reasons for this is they are usually very minimal and non-significant and therefore not reported. Sometimes the donor lives at a long distance from the blood transfusion service, and in case of any reaction does not call back to the blood transfusion service. And if he has any problem, he usually goes to a nearby physician. So there are very few studies regarding the delayed adverse donor events. I think most of us who are pursuing transfusion medicine are aware of this classification of adverse donor events, but for the sake of completion, I'm listing them out. They can be related to the local symptoms, that is hematoma, arterial puncture, delayed bleeding, nerve injury. They can be superficial thrombophlebitis, cellulitis, deep vein thrombosis, arteriovenous fistula, compartment syndrome, brachial artery pseudoaneurysms. These are the rarer ones. The generalized symptoms, vasovagal reactions, either with loss of consciousness, no loss of consciousness, or with loss of consciousness, accompanied by maybe sometimes convulsions or incontinence. Related to apheresis, there are citrate reactions, hemolysis, air embolism, etc. Allergic reactions may occur, and there might be serious complications. If you look at the list of the serious complications, they are usually associated with some cardiac disorder, and therefore it is a common rule in transfusion medicine that we never take any donor who has any history of any cardiac event or any is taking drugs for any cardiac issue. Although acute donor reactions are very extensively studied, delayed adverse donor reactions studies are few, and we have listed them over here. And you can see that there's quite a prevalence, the variation in prevalence being 36%, 25%, 38%, 10%, 13%, 19% for R2 studies. So you can see there's quite a prevalence of this. When you are actively following it up and doing surveillance, then only you come to know this. Otherwise, it's all absent from literature. So the study we had planned this to determine the impact of delayed adverse donor events in addition to immediate donor events on the intention of future donations. And the secondary objective was to identify donors at the risk of delayed ADs with an aim to take adequate precautionary steps to improve the donor safety, and to identify populations with lower IFDs so that steps may be taken to improve future blood donation in these. The study was conducted from October 2018 to July 2019. All immediate ADRs were reported. Donors were called twice to study delayed donor ADRs. One was done at the just the next day, and the other was done at the end of 14 days. So we had this 3946 consecutive blood donors and 584 platelet pheresis donors. All immediate donor events were documented. Telephonic interview was done after 14 days for delayed adverse donor events. And finally, some of them did not respond to the second call. So we had finally had 5314 and 531 donors respectively. And after the interdonation interval was over, we called them for intention for future donation. Whole blood donors had a higher intention for future donation as compared to platelet pheresis donors. Our higher IFD was observed in male donors, although I would not put a lot of emphasis on this because we had very few female donors. Repeat whole blood donors had a higher IFD compared to first-time donors, and this was seen both in blood donors and platelet donors. So here we have the records of the IFD. You can see the overall IFD in the donors for the whole blood donation was 89% for 5.53, and for the platelet pheresis donors was 5.06, which was again highly significant for the whole blood donors. Younger donors had a lower IFTs compared to the elder counterparts. A similar trend was also seen in platelet donors, but this time here it was not statistically significant. The impact of immediate adverse donor events on donors' intention for future donation. The whole blood donors reported immediate ADs has a significantly lower IFD compared to controls. And VVRs, because VVRs are very dramatic in their, what you call it, in their experience, they had a more negative impact on IFDs compared to hematomas. So you can see the different kind of adverse donor events and their impact on this IFD. Hematoma for patients who donors who had hematomas, 77.61% had intention for future donation, while those who experienced VVRs had only 55%. And this can be seen, a further reduction can be seen in the platelet donors, where you can see a 57.89% and 25% for the respectively for hematoma and VVRs. So the impact of the delayed adverse donor events on the donor intention for future donation, again, whole blood donors who experience delayed ADS has a significantly lower IFT as compared to controls. Localized delayed ADS, only donors with bruising had a significantly lower IFT when compared to controls. The rest of the localized delayed ADS, such as sore arms, hematomas, did not have a significant effect on the donor IFT. In case of systemic delayed ADS, delayed VVRs had a significantly reduced IFT. Post-donation fatigue and generalized weakness also had a similar impact on the donor's IFD. Systemic delayed ADS such as fatigue and VVRs had a more negative impact on IFD compared to local delayed ADS. So here is the individual impact of the individual adverse events on the delayed IFD, which you can see the overall localized ADs had a lower impact, and the localized over systematic had a more greater impact on the IFT. You can clearly see here you have an for localized it was 86%, while for systemic it was 63% in whole blood donors, and the same 58% and 29% in platelet donors. Here you can see there's a significant impact of the IFD or with regard to both immediate and delayed IFDs, ADs. So overall, 23.08% of the whole blood donors with a history of delayed ADs actually donated compared to 25.16% of whole blood donors in the control group. Among platelet pheresis donors, 7.02% of the donors who experienced delayed ADs donated platelets as compared to 5.6% in the control group. Over here, it is quite a what you call the irony that more of them who had experienced delayed ADs donated for the platelet pheresis. After the interdonation interval, IFD increased in donors who experienced DADs. IFD decreased in donors from the control group. Overall, IFD remained higher in controls. One of the reasons for this may be that the enthusiasm and motivation immediately after donation may wean off after time, and the impact of this AD also decreases over time. So the negative impact of adverse donor events of immediate ones is well known, but the evidence correlating delayed ADs and donor return rate is scarce, and we have this data available with us. Effective donor recruitment and retention programs require the knowledge of factors that impact donors' intention for repeat donations. A study by Newman et al. On whole blood donors showed a 34% decrease in donor return rate after delayed VVRs and a 20% decrease after delayed fatigue. The present study shows a 41% decrease in IFD after delayed VVRs and 35% decrease.
27-28 को है, Saturday Sunday है नहीं, online.
Why platelet pheresis donors don't want to donate platelet again? Irrespective of the ADs, whole blood donors are more willing to donate. So, you know, you ask the platelet pheresis donors why they are not so willing. One of the major reasons is most of the donors who come from platelets are not aware that it's going to take so much time. So the time constraint has been one of the main reasons the donors have given for a reduction in the IFD, that is an intention for future donation, because it's going to take more time, while blood donation is a shorter procedure and they are more ready to donate blood, whole blood. So what are the steps we can take to decrease the negative impact of ADs on IFDs? Any donor who has had an immediate AD should be counseled about the nature of ADs, the clinical course of the ADs, and precautions to be taken. reassurance plays a very important role. All the blood transfusion services staff should be educated about DDs, should tell the donor about the respective DADs, and ask them to call the blood transfusion service if there's any issue. All donors who had any form of immediate AD should be contacted the next day for feedback and advice. This will create a goodwill for the blood transfusion services and may result in a positive impact on return donations. This telephonic interview can also be used as an opportunity to motivate donors for future donations. And Sinclair et al. Have shown that a motivational post-donor interview increases donor retention. Educating first-time and repeat donations about different immediate and delayed ADs may be important in preventing ADs and improving IFD, such as explaining the skin color change after hematoma. Because the color changes and it looks quite dramatic on the arm, so some of the people get quite anxious about it. If we just allay the anxiety, it may result in a better retention of donors. The strength of the present study was that it gave an insight into possible impact of DADs on donor intentions for future donation, both in whole blood and platelet pheresis donors. It is the largest number of participants in a single study, and we had a very non-persuasive and unbiased donor opinions. It was taken in a very objective manner, the reporting. Donors' intention for future donation may not convert into actual donation, and to avoid donor embarrassment and discomfort, reasons for not donating again were not actively pursued. We did not want to embarrass the donors. It was just asked very generally. The majority of whole blood donors and all platelet donors were males. Hence, gender-wise comparison is not convincing because we have very few females coming and donating at our center. Both immediate and delayed days are negatively impact the donors' intention for future donation. Repeat donors are more likely to continue, and irrespective of ADDs, platelet pheresis donors are less likely to donate again. Systemic ADs like vasovagal reactions have a greater impact, and post-donation fatigue have a greater impact on intention for future donation as compared to localized reactions. And post-donation counseling definitely has a very important role. Thank you very much.
Brilliant study, I must say, Dr. Meenu, for this excellent presentation. And it's an eye-opener. As you rightly said, that we take more care of the immediate reactions and we forget about the delayed reactions, which is important. And the figures which you are showing, that around close to 35% or 40% as reported in the Western literature and about 10% in the Indian literature, goes to prove that we should not be forgetting about these delayed reactions which can happen. So it's a wonderful presentation, an eye-opener, and let me congratulate you and your team for this.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Dr. Pathik.
Mute.
Sir, please unmute yourself.
I think I'm audible now. Hello.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Now, from our experience, we find that there is always some difference between the attention and the care we can afford the donors in our own blood bank setting and in the mass blood donation camps. So is this an important factor that the mass blood donation camps, the donor intention to donate in future, that is percentage wise, that is more or less, less. So both donating in mass donation camp, most of them they do not come forward to donate again.
I think when you go to voluntary blood donation camps, all this study was done with people who were coming as replacement donations over here at ILBS. When you talk of voluntary donors, they have multiple motivations. One of them is the group feeling in their community, because you're going out into the community. So there are multiple factors which work over there, which the dynamics may be very different from what a person coming to the blood center to donate, and a hospital-based blood center to donate. So I think a different dynamics works over there, and that also needs to be studied in that particular setting. I think that would be a very interesting study to take up.
Thank you, madam.
Dr. Meenu, as a practice, you called all the donors the following day, or only those who had reaction?
Those who had donor reaction. If there's even a mild donor reaction, even if it takes off the swab and it starts bleeding again, even for those small things, if a donor has a reaction, definitely we try to call him the next day. We are not a very large blood bank. We have only a 10,000 collection per year, and we have 2 counselors.
Okay.
So we have people who have the time to go around and call back and have the time to do this work.
Okay. Thank you so much. Any questions?
Yes,
from the audience?
we have two questions for you. The first question is, were all these reactions in first-time donors or some were repeat donors? As current
I
guidelines.
think you can go through the publication. There were repeat donors and there were first-time donors. I don't remember the exact stats. But we have two studies, published studies. You can go for the, because detailing it all over here was not possible. You can go and read through that. I think that will be better.
Okay. And the second question is how the information about the IFD was obtained.
It was through telephonic interview by a doctor, not by the counselor in this particular study.
Okay, so any particular structured questionnaire was there, sort of, or any kind of
yes,
question?
there was a structured questionnaire. It's again in the publication. You can see it over there.
Okay, ma'am. Okay, thank you, ma'am. Okay, if no more questions, we can move on to the next speaker. Dr. Trupti, please introduce the next speaker.
I would like to thank everybody for the kind attention. And I have another meeting, so I'm just departing. If possible, I'll join you back.
Sure, ma'am.
Okay.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. I would like to introduce Dr. Divjot Singh. He is our third speaker. His area of interest in transfusion transmitted infection testing and quality aspects of TTI labs, platelet therapeutic hemopheresis, platelet refractoriness, and platelet serology testing, donor motivation, recruitment, and increasing voluntary blood donation. He awarded best poster second prize in immunohematology category in Transcon 2011. He also got a PG Fellowship Award third prize in Transcon 2011. Harold Ganson Fellowship in 24th Regional Conference of ISBT held in Malaysia. Her greater than 6 national and greater than 5 international publication. He is also member of ISBT, IABB, ATAM, AJTS. He is reviewer of a journal like AJTS, IGS, Indian Journal of Pediatrics. Please, Dr. Divjot, you can start now your presentation. Thank you. Dr. Divjot?
Hello?
Yes. You are audible. You can start.
Okay. So I thank the YPF and the honorable chairpersons for giving me the opportunity. So I hope my screen is visible. So I'll start with the case report, which was presented as a poster at Hematocon Virtual 2020. It's about von Willebrand disease management during pregnancy. So first, intro about von Willebrand disease. It's an autosomal disorder, could be autosomal dominant and autosomal recessive, a hereditary bleeding disorder, which is characterized by either a qualitative or a quantitative defect in the von Willebrand factor. Von Willebrand factor, a clotting protein, but the normal levels are normal plasma levels of 10 milligram per liter and a half-life of 6 to 15 hours. The role of VWF is to transport and stabilize the factor rate. VWF protects factor rate from proteolytic degradation, prolonging its half-life. It also additionally provides an adhesion of the platelets to the endothelial lining. A structural defect or a severe deficiency of this von Willebrand factor would be responsible for secondary factor VIII deficiency, resulting in bleeding diastasis. Type 1 is the most common. And during pregnancy and parturition, various pattern changes are seen, which we will discuss further. So coming to the my case. So it's a case of 34-year-old primary gravida female who was diagnosed as von Willebrand type 2, non-type 2B, diagnosed at our institute in the past. So it was a known case, and the patient enrolled at the institute at 22 weeks of period of gestation for antenatal checkup because of her knowledge of medical condition, additional precautions which may be required. So the patient was staff nurse by profession, was admitted in PGI at 34 weeks period of gestation, keeping in view the transfusion support which would be required. Coming to the history of present illness, patient is a primary gravida, no history of any fresh bleeding episode at the time of delivery or just preceding the delivery was there. LSCS was planned keeping in view breech presentation with anterior grade 3 placenta and a left-sided uterine fibroid. Obstetric history, menorrhagia was present since puberty with increased flow 5 parts per day during the periods. Irregular periods were there and increased duration of flow was there. Coming to the past history of the case, the patient had increased bleeding per vaginum single episode in 2000 when her HB dropped to 2 grams per deciliter, for which she was transfused with 2 units of PRBC. She underwent tonsillectomy in 2003, and again post-op she had prolonged bleeding, which required suturing of the tonsillar bed. History of occasional epistaxis was present, which was non-traumatic. History of increased bleeding during trauma was present. No history of joint pain and swelling was there. In the family history, her mother and niece had similar coagulation and factor profiles. Coming to the investigations which were done during the antenatal period and during the after the delivery. So delivery was by cesarean section, keeping in view the condition of the patient. So at 20 weeks, the normal prothrombin time was normal, PTI was normal, INR was in the normal range, APTT was more or less in the normal range. Then fibrogen assay was not done at that time. Factor rate VWF assay was not done. At 31 plus 5 weeks, the factor rate assay was 54%, and the von Willebrand antigen assay was increased. So normal value is 3.5 to 26.6 micrograms per ml, and the ristostatin cofactor assay was which normal value is 50 to 200%. It was decreased markedly at 16.4%. So the findings suggested a type 2 von Willebrand disease, and further the genetic studies were not done till date. So whether it is which type of type 2 was not decipherable, except that it is not type 2B. The platelet counts were in the normal range. So the patient was advised during management. Patient was advised injection Immunate, which is plasma-derived factor 8 with 1 Willebrand factor, containing 250 international unit factor 8 and 190 international unit 1 Willebrand factor at a dose of 19 international units per kg, with a target of keeping the ristostatin cofactor activity assay at 15 international units at the time of delivery and afterwards for around 6 to 7 days. So total dose prescribed was 6 vials of 250 microgram each, given twice a day, starting 0 day of delivery. That is 300 unit BD at day 0, 1, 2, and tapered to 1500 units at 3 and up to day 5 post-op. In case of excess bleeding, patient was admitted injection Tranexa 1 gram TDS, and Department of Transfusion Medicine was also notified for prior arrangement of required components, packed RBCs and cryoprecipitate in case of bleeding as an additional supportive measure, though they were not required. LSCS and post-op period 1 uneventful. It is recommended to maintain levels of von Willebrand factor and factor 8 above 15 international units per deciliter or higher during delivery and afterwards to prevent the PPH. So treatment advised was injection Immunate, which is a purified freeze-dried human coagulation factor 8 along with von Willebrand factor 190 international units. So just an overview of the history of von Willebrand disease. It was first described in 1926 by a Finnish physician, Erik von Willebrand. This condition was also usually associated with reduced levels of factor 8. And factor 8 deficiency could be replaced through infusion of plasma. Significant advance was made by 2 groups of investigators who showed for the first time using the immunological assay that these 2 factors were different. A distinct nature of von Willebrand factor was definitely demonstrated by the characterization of a von Willebrand gene by 4 independent investigators. This was in 1985. Coming to the genetics, as I've already said, it is the factor gene is located on chromosome 12. It's an autosomal dominant. Moreover, in some cases, it is autosomal recessive. So if one parent has a dominant inheritance, so a 50% chance of child having the von Willebrand disease mutation would be there. Then coming to the von Willebrand factor structure. So it's a dimer protein. It has various sites like D1, D2, which is a pro-peptide site, then factor VIII binding site, and there is a GP1B binding site for platelets and collagen site. Then there's a cleavage site, which is cleaved by ADAMTS13 metalloprotease enzyme in the plasma. Then there is glycoprotein 2B3A binding site. And according to this diagram shows different mutations will take place by which the different types of von Willebrand disease can be described. So I'll be coming to the types. So first of all, the production of the von Willebrand factor, it's synthesized in the vascular endothelium, stored in the weevil palate bodies and released in response to stress, and also in the bone marrow megakaryocytes, stored in the alpha granules and released in response to platelet activation signals. The complex cellular processing consists of dimerization in the endoplasmic reticulum, then glycosylation, multimerization, and packaging into storage granules. The von Willebrand propeptide is released in equimolar concentrations to a mature BWF molecule. After the multimers are secreted into the blood, they are subjected to proteolysis, including cleavage during shear stress conditions, and also clearance by macrophages. So coming to how do we approach such a case of von Willebrand factor disease? So first, beginning with detailed personal and family history features. In the history, we'll find features suggestive of a platelet disorder versus a coagulation factor deficiency disorder. And we'll rule out underlying medical conditions that may also increase bleeding, that is liver disease, connective tissue disorders, and any drug intake. We'll start with the complete blood counts. Then we'll go to the further von Willebrand profile testing and coagulogram. So coming to the various blood tests, that is platelet tests, PT, APTT, TT, and fibrinogen. So in hemophilia, comparing hemophilia A with von Willebrand, in hemophilia there will be a marked increase of APTT, whereas in von Willebrand disease it can be prolonged or it can be within the normal limit as well. And all the other tests like platelets, PT, TT are normal. Fibrinogen may or may not be low. So by this way, we'll not be able to diagnose this VWD. So we'll further. This is a guidelines given by the National Heart Lung Blood Institute, where the particular questions are asked to the patient. So if the history is suggestive of like if the blood relative ever needed any medical attention during or after surgery, there was any bleeding problem during dental extraction with trauma, during childbirth, if the answer is yes, we proceed to further questions like if the relative of the blood has any bleeding disorder or any prolonged bleeding from trivial wounds is there, or you have had heavy prolonged recurrent bleeding after surgical procedure. So if this is yes, and if this is also yes, we'll proceed to further evaluation. So further evaluation would be by laboratory evaluation, that is the complete blood counts. And then if the complete blood counts are also not suggestive of any important deficiency coming in the complete blood counts, then the von Willebrand assays are done, that is the von Willebrand antigen assay, von Willebrand ristostatin cofactor assay, and the factor VIII assays. And further, if these are abnormal, then this is the BGHS guidelines which explain which all tests are done, and accordingly the type of von Willebrand disease that can be deciphered. So there are various types of von Willebrand disease I'll be discussing subsequently. First is type 1, in which there is qualitative deficiency of the von Willebrand disease. Then type 2. Type 1 is quantity is decreased, type 2 quality is decreased, and in type 3 all the VWF is absent. So in type 1, coming to von Willebrand factor antigen assay, comparing with von Willebrand ristostatin cofactor assay, then von Willebrand ristostatin cofactor by von Willebrand factor antigen ratio, factor VIII, low dose ristostatin induced platelet aggregation, and multimer assay. So by all these assays, we will be able to decipher which subtype of the von Willebrand is there. Type 1, type 2A, 2B, 2M, 2N, and 3. In type 1, there is quantity of the one blend factor is decreased. Type 2A, there is decrease in large multimers. And in type 2B, there is decrease in large multimers as well as increased aggregation with platelet glycoproteins. In type 2M, the multimers are normal, but the one blend factor antigen is low, as well as the platelet binding glycoprotein 1b, there is decreased binding. And in type N, there is it is also called autosomal hemophilia, where the one blend factor fails to bind with the factor 8. So this is again another type of assessment which can be done for the one blend patients. This is the bleeding assessment score, which is specifically designed for diagnosing type 1 one blend disease. Why it is specifically for type 1? Because type 1 is the most common one blend disease, and in the periphery, this bleeding score can be used to diagnose and start the treatment of patients if they have any type of, if the one blend disease is diagnosed. And according to the bleeding score, likelihood ratio of this explains the likelihood ratio. As the bleeding score increases, the likelihood ratio of having type 1 one blend disease will increase. So coming to various types of one blend disease, type 1, as I said, is the most common. Then it is most common form and having a quantitative deficiency of one blend factor. Then there is proportionate reduced levels of factor 8. One blend ristostatin cofactor SA is decreased. One blend antigen is decreased. So one blend is structurally and functionally normal. So then in type 2, qualitative deficiency is there. Type 2 corresponds to decreased platelet dependent one blend function with selective deficiency of high molecular weight multimers. So there is loss of platelet dependent function. Only small PWF multimers are present, and could be due to abnormal assembly and secretion of the large VWF multimers. So this diagram shows the multimers in the normal. In type 1, the quantity is decreased. In type 2, the quality is deficient. And in type 3, all the VWF is absent. Type 2B corresponds to gain of function mutation, whereby there is increased affinity of binding of glycoprotein 1b platelet receptor. So spontaneous binding to platelets, rapid clearance of large multimers, and thrombocytopenia is there. The mutation is in the A1 domain. In type 2, also called as VWD Normandy or autosomal hemophilia, mutations are in the factor 8 binding region. So the VWF will not bind to factor 8, and the factor 8 can be cleaved easily in the plasma. Then by the proteolytic enzymes. Type 2M, it is characterized by decreased binding to the platelet glycoprotein 1b. Normal multimer levels are there, and high molecular weight multimers are also present. So type N showing the VWF binding site is abnormal, and type 2M, whereby the mutation is in the A1 domain and causing glycoprotein 1b decreased binding with the VWF. So type 3 VWF, it is most severe form of the disease, though it is rarest. 1 to 5% of cases, and prevalence increases with consanguineous marriages. Results from homozygous mutation leading to deficiency with absent or profound deficiency of VWF. So it is an autosomal recessive inheritance. VWF levels are less than 5%. Factor 8 is markedly cleared from the plasma. Factor 8 is not severely dispersed as in hemophilia A. So coming to our case, which was VWF disease in pregnancy. So in pregnancy, the risk of PPH is much higher as compared to the general population. Factor 8 and VWF factors rise during pregnancy, especially in the second and third trimesters. But in patients with VWF, these factor rise would not be there. Qualitative abnormalities will continue to persist in pregnancy, especially in type 2 one blend disease. And our case was of type 2 one blend disease. So this diagram shows changes in the VWF levels in pregnancy. One blend factor antigen without the one blend disease, it rises in second and third trimester, whereas in a patient with one blend deficiency, this rise would not be there. And near to the delivery, this factor would rise, and this would decrease later on during postpartum. So in a patient with who is untreated type 1, this factor would not rise, and that can cause to PPH in the during or after pregnancy. So final diagnosis of our patient was 1-blunt type 2, non-type 2B. So there are various guidelines I'll discuss subsequently. So it is recommended by them to maintain levels of VWF and factor 8 above 50 international units or higher during delivery for 3 to 5 days after delivery. Average time of onset of PPH is usually 11 to 23 days post delivery. Therefore, monitoring the factors during this time is very important, and maintaining the necessary 50 international unit per deciliter level. Desmopressin can be used after beginning of the labor as close to time of delivery. So desmopressin will cause the release of VWF from the Weber palate bodies. So it cause increase of the VWF level. But it can also cause uterine contraction. So it can only be used just prior to delivery. So this is a very nice review article in the American Journal of Gynecology, where 1-blunt disease and pregnancy, a practical approach is given, especially for pregnancy. So clinical pearls for management of 1-blunt disease during pregnancy, we should consider the diagnosis in patients with mild to moderate mucocutaneous bleeds such as epistaxis, menorrhagia. So all these findings were there in our patient. Delayed postpartum hemorrhage, bleeding after dental extractions, ecchymosis, gingival bleeding, prolonged bleedings from minor cuts. Patient with menorrhagia and no documented pelvic abnormalities should be also be screened for 1-blunt disease. Detailed laboratory testing, it is basic to identify correct subtype of the disease. Once diagnosed, follow-up factor 8 levels should be monitored at least once every trimester. Genetic counseling should be given. Factor 8 levels at 50 international unit before any invasive procedure at the time of delivery and during postpartum period ideally should be there till 2 weeks after delivery, and if possible avoid pudendal blocks, episiotomies and operative vaginal deliveries. So this is from this paper only, peripartum management of 1-blunt disease. So we'll do the counts, we'll diagnose the patient. If it is a type 1 1-blunt disease, we'll give desmopressin and maintain the levels of VWF above 15 international units. If it is a type 2 VWD, we'll give desmopressin as well as VWF concentrates to maintain the level at or more than 15 international unit per liter and maintain levels. Then if it's a type 3 severe deficiency, VWF concentrates, follow-up factor 8 and VWF risostatin cofactor daily and maintain levels of greater than 50 international unit during labor, delivery and up to 5 days postpartum. So we have to follow up these patients specifically 2 weeks postpartum, especially if cesarean section, like in our case, and provide prophylaxis accordingly to avoid late postpartum hemorrhage. So what is the role of cryoprecipitate? So basically the management is by 1-blunt concentrate only, the recombinant or the human-derived factors. But if the patient is not affording, the cryoprecipitates can be given as an adjuvant as 1 unit.
Dr. Divjot, if you could please wind up.
Yes, sir. Just 2 minutes. So additional transfusion support in type 3 patients. So in type 3 patients, the absence, the platelet transfusion is also advised because it has a hemostatic effect of normal platelet transfusion in patients with severe 1-blunt disease. And coming to the conclusion, 1-blunt disease is associated with a wide heterogeneity of phenotypes and each with a unique underlying pathophysiological mechanism. In certain situations, it has been reported that women who have had the requirement of urgent hemostatic treatment in view of excessive blood loss during delivery process, and hence well characterization of the disease subtype and good robust transfusion support mechanism would always ensure a safe and uneventful delivery in such cases. These are my references, and thank you all for patient listening.
Thank you, Dr. Divjot, for a brilliant and exhaustive presentation covering all the various guidelines and what has been done in this case. Initially, it may appear very confusing, the nomenclature, but I think it's not all that difficult. And I've got one question to ask you. In this case, did we do multiple studies to delineate whether it is type A or type 2A or type 2N, 2M?
No, sir. In this case, the multimer studies as well as the genetic study to delineate the genetic deficiency has not been done. Till the follow-up was there last, it was not done.
Okay, okay. Thank you. Yeah, Dr. Pati.
No comments.
Yeah. So any questions from the audience?
No, I think no questions from the audience. So we can now end the session. Dr. Soumya, please say a vote of thanks to all audience. Dr. Soumya?
First of all, thank you, Chairperson Anil sir and Pati sir for sparing time for the session, and three speakers, Mohan sir, Meenu madam, and Dr. Debjot for sharing their research work in our platform of YPF, and to all the audience for the patient for attending the session. And we will be sharing the certificates after the session. By tomorrow, all of you will be getting the certificates, and the session is recorded, and we will be uploading it to our YouTube channel. And do subscribe to the YouTube channel, which is the Young Professional Forum, for all updates in the field. Thank you. I'll end the meeting now. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
All the speakers and the audience and the team, Young Professional Forum. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.